In the early 1950s, Iran stood at a crossroads between tradition and modernity, nationalism and foreign-controlled democracy and authoritarianism. It was a nation whose fate would soon be entangled with the deepest intrigues of the Cold War, where superpowers cast their shadows across its deserts, cities, and oil fields. To understand the events of 1953, one must first step back into the atmosphere of tension that had been building for decades, where the seeds of revolution, betrayal, and resistance were already taking root. For centuries, Iran had been both coveted and constrained by foreign powers. Its position at the crossroads of Asia and its vast natural resources made it irresistible to empires. By the early 20th century, Britain had gained significant control over Iran's oil through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC. This was no ordinary commercial venture. It was the backbone of Britain's naval supremacy, fueling warships and sustaining its empire. Yet while London grew rich, the Iranian people saw little benefit from the black gold that flowed beneath their soil. In village after village, poverty endured, and in the bazaars of Tehran, frustration simmered against foreign exploitation. Amid this atmosphere, the young Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi inherited the peacock throne, after his father was forced to abdicate under British and Soviet pressure during World War II. The Shah represented continuity of monarchy, yet he lacked both the charisma and the independence to unite the nation. Real power increasingly came from the parliament and a new generation of nationalist leaders determined to reclaim Iran's sovereignty. Among them rose Mohammad Mossadegh, a man whose fiery speeches and uncompromising stance against foreign domination would capture the imagination of millions. By 1951, Mossadegh was swept to the position of Prime Minister, riding a wave of popular demand to take back Iran's oil. His call for nationalization of the AIOC struck like a thunderclap across the world. To the Iranian people, it was an act of justice, a declaration that their resources were not for sale to foreign masters. But to Britain, it was a direct assault on its economic lifeline. To Washington, watching nervously through the lens of Cold War paranoia, Mossadegh appeared less like a Democrat and more like a potential opening for Soviet influence. Yet Mossadegh was not a radical communist, nor a revolutionary in the mold of Lenin or Mao. He was in many respects a constitutionalist, who believed in the power of parliament and the sovereignty of the nation. But in the climate of 1950s geopolitics, nuance mattered little. Any leader who dared challenge Western oil interests risked being branded a threat, and Mossadegh soon found himself caught in a tightening vice. Britain sought to strangle Iran's economy with embargoes and blockades while lobbying the Americans to take a harder line. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had long been the symbol of this imbalance. Founded in 1908 after the discovery of oil in Iran, the company grew into a pillar of British economic and strategic power. The royalties paid to Iran were meager, often less than what the company spent on taxes back home. Iranian oil fueled the British Navy-powered factories and underpinned London's global reach. But in Abadan, the heart of Iran's oil industry workers toiled in miserable conditions. Their wages were low, their housing squalid, and their future uncertain. The resentment grew year after year, and by the time Mossadegh came to power, it had become a tidal wave. Mossadegh's campaign for nationalization was not just about economics, it was about dignity. He argued that Iran, like any sovereign nation, had the right to control its natural resources. His speeches in Parliament and his defiance on the international stage electrified the public. In the streets, crowds rallied in his support, chanting his name as a symbol of independence. For many Iranians, Mossadegh embodied a long-delayed promise, the chance to stand free from foreign domination and build a future on their own terms. But such defiance carried consequences. Britain, unwilling to lose its prized asset, launched a multifaceted counterattack. Diplomatically, it lobbied allies to isolate Iran. Economically, It imposed a boycott that strangled oil exports, cutting off the country's primary source of revenue. Militarily, it positioned forces nearby, hinting at intervention. At the United Nations and The Hague, Britain argued against nationalization, portraying Mossadegh as reckless and unlawful. But Mossadegh defended his position with eloquence and legal precision, winning admiration even among neutral observers. Still, admiration did not fill the state's coffers, and the pressure on Iran grew unbearable. As the crisis deepened, Mossadegh's government struggled to balance idealism with pragmatism. With oil revenues blocked, Iran's economy faltered. Inflation rose, unemployment spread, and discontent simmered. Yet Mossadegh remained steadfast, refusing to compromise with Britain's demands. His defiance earned him enemies not only abroad, but also within Iran. The Shah resented Mossadegh's growing influence. Clerics distrusted his secular nationalism, and conservative landowners feared his reforms. The unity that had propelled him to power began to fragment under the weight of crisis. It was in this context that the United States, initially hesitant, stepped decisively into the fray. At first, Washington had viewed Mossadegh with cautious sympathy. After all, he was not a communist, and his democratic legitimacy distinguished him from many authoritarian leaders in the region. But as the Cold War intensified, perspectives hardened. Influenced by Britain's lobbying and alarmed by the possibility that Iran might drift toward the Soviet sphere, U.S. policymakers began to see Mossadegh less as a nationalist reformer and more as a liability. Within the corridors of power, the debate narrowed to a stark choice: allow Mossadegh to continue, risking instability and potential Soviet influence, or remove him and secure Iran firmly within the Western camp. The decision was made quietly but firmly. In 1953, under the leadership of the CIA, and in coordination with Britain's MI6 Operation Ajax, was born a covert plan to overthrow Mossadegh and restore the Shah's full authority. Operation Ajax was a masterpiece of manipulation. Rather than relying solely on brute force, it wove together money, media, and muscle to reshape the political landscape. CIA operatives led by Kermit Roosevelt Jr. funneled cash to politicians, clerics, journalists, and street thugs. Newspapers suddenly published articles portraying Mossadegh as weak, unstable, even sympathetic to communism. Leaflets and rumors spread through Tehran, eroding his support. At the same time, mobs were organized to create chaos, staging riots that could be blamed on Mossadegh's government. The plan also targeted the Shah, whose vacillation was a constant concern. Initially hesitant and fearful, the Shah had fled Iran at the first sign of failure. But with American and British reassurance and the promise of restored power, he reluctantly signed decrees dismissing Mossadegh and appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi as Prime Minister. These decrees, though of questionable legality, provided the thin veneer of legitimacy the coup needed. The first attempt to execute the plan faltered, and for a moment, it seemed Mossadegh might survive. But within days, the tide turned. On August 19, 1953, orchestrated crowds filled Tehran's streets, clashing with Mossadegh's supporters. Tanks rolled through the capital, and military units switched sides. After hours of chaos, Mossadegh's home was attacked, and his government collapsed. The man who had defied empires was arrested, tried, and eventually confined to house arrest, where he would spend the rest of his life. The coup's success transformed Iran overnight. The Shah returned this time not as a constitutional monarch, but as a ruler with expanded powers. Backed by American support, he consolidated authority, suppressing opposition, and dismantling the fragile democratic institutions that had begun to take root. Political parties were banned, newspapers censored, and dissent crushed. To enforce his rule, the Shah created a new instrument of control, SAVAK, a secret police force trained with American and Israeli assistance. It became notorious for its surveillance, intimidation, and torture, casting a pall of fear over Iranian society. Yet repression was paired with promises of progress. With revenues from a newly formed oil consortium, which now included American companies alongside Britain, the Shah launched ambitious modernization programs. Roads, schools, and factories sprang up, and Tehran began to resemble a modern capital. But beneath the surface, discontent smoldered. Rural poverty persisted, the clergy resented westernization, and the memory of Mossadegh's betrayal lingered in the hearts of many. The international consequences of the coup were equally profound. For Washington, Iran became a model of what covert action could achieve. The CIA's success emboldened policymakers, leading to similar operations in Guatemala, Congo, Chile, and beyond. Each time the lesson of 1953 was invoked, democracy could be sacrificed for stability, and sovereignty could be overridden by strategic necessity. But the long-term costs were harder to calculate. In Iran, resentment toward the United States grew steadily fueled by the perception that Washington had stolen the nation's independence. This resentment would explode in 1979 when revolution toppled the Shah and replaced him with an Islamic republic bitterly hostile to the West. For Britain, the coup salvaged some influence, but underscored its waning global role. Sharing Iran's oil with American companies was a humiliation, a reminder that the empire was no longer supreme. Yet for many in the region, Britain's involvement confirmed suspicions of imperial arrogance, feeding anti-colonial movements that sought to break free of Western domination. The coup's broader legacy was one of disillusionment. In the developing world, intellectuals and leaders watched Iran's experiment in democracy crushed beneath the weight of oil and empire. Some drew caution from Mossadegh's fate, choosing accommodation with great powers. Others drew inspiration, radicalizing in the belief that only revolution could secure true independence. Either way, 1953 became a reference point, a symbol of both the dangers of defying imperialism and the necessity of resistance. For Iranians, the memory of Mossadegh endured as a symbol of integrity and defiance. Though silenced and confined, he represented the path, but not taken, the possibility of a nation governed by its people, free from foreign domination. His absence was itself a presence, a haunting reminder of what had been lost. The Shah might have ruled, but Mossadegh remained in the conscience of the nation. Looking back, the coup of 1953 stands as one of the most consequential events of the 20th century. It was a moment when the aspirations of a people collided with the interests of empires, when sovereignty was sacrificed for oil and Cold War strategy. Its legacies are etched in the distrust that still shapes relations between Iran and the West, in the revolutionary fervor that erupted decades later, and in the lessons drawn by nations struggling for independence. The coup was both an ending and a beginning. The end of Iran's democratic experiment, and the beginning of a cycle of repression and resistance that continues to this day. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by open battles and public debates, but also by the hidden hands of covert operations where decisions made in secrecy can alter the destinies of nations. The story of 1953 is thus not confined to the past. It lives in the anger of protesters, in the pride of those who remember Mossadegh's defiance, and in the policies of states wary of foreign influence. It is a story of betrayal, but also of resilience, a story of how fire and oil, once ignited, can burn across generations, leaving behind legacies that still smolder in the heart of Iran and in the conscience of the world.